Well, one of the things that we're going to see with civilizations like China is that occasionally the systems are going to fall apart, emperors are going to fall, and new dynasties will be put into place. We're going to be talking about this dynastic cycle in a few minutes, but I also want to introduce to you kind of the concept of implosion. Implosion is an interesting concept. If, for instance, you've ever seen a tall skyscraper demolished, sometimes they do it with implosion. And by that, they put in dynamite charges throughout the building, and then they set off the dynamite. The dynamite weakens the structure of the building, so it weakens it internally, and gravity is the external pressure, which finally brings the weakened building down. So a combination of internal and external problems often will bring in implosion, will cause a nation or an empire like China to implode, especially as the outer areas, the periphery, become subject to invasion. So we see our little invader, and the Chinese often regarded people from the outside who were not Chinese as barbarians, so we'll just call him a barbarian invader. And he looks pretty strong, and he's evidencing this external strength, which can then come to play in weakening the periphery of an empire like China. And this is perhaps China at any particular time where it's becoming weak internally, and when it becomes weak internally, then it becomes subject to invasions from external forces. Well, first of all, we need to define what Asia is, because China is a large part of Asia. Some people talk about one continent, Eurasia, because really it is one continent. But historically, we've tended to see it as two, Europe and Asia. And when we do that, we tend to the distinguishing boundaries are two. The Ural Mountains and the Ural River of Russia divide the European part of Russia from the Asian part of Russia. And the Dardanelles, the Sea of Marmara, and here are the Dardanelles, the Sea of Marmara, and the Bosphorus Strait divide the European part of the world from the Asian part of the world. So Turkey would actually be considered Asia. Well, we always know that China is safely in Asia, but I think everybody who takes a course in any Asian history needs to understand that this really is kind of an artificial distinction. And that kind of tells you a little bit about what historians and what the civilizations themselves have tended to have in terms of perspectives of things. And then this, of course, shows Russia. And here you see China clearly outlined with some of its neighbors like Pakistan, Nepal, India, etc. And, of course, over here, North and South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and, of course, Southeast Asia with Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, etc. Now, one of the ways you can understand Asian history or history of any part of the world is to understand a little bit about weather and climate, because weather and climate had a very important impact on early civilizations, on the beginning of settlement of those early civilizations, on agriculture, especially in Neolithic times, and certainly all the way up to the present day, because it helps us understand what resources were there and what food and agricultural resources are available for, say, a growing population, particularly a population as large as China's with well over 1 billion people. First of all, let's consider two little weather commandments. One is that land areas heat up and cool down more rapidly than water, and conversely, water heats up and cools down more slowly than land. Thus, water has a tempering effect on climate. And we show you some water here. Imagine if you're hot in the summer. Where would you go in the summer to cool off? Well, you would go to a lake or an ocean or a river, and maybe a pool, swimming pool someplace. And the reason why is because water takes longer to heat up in the summer. And so there it has a tempering effect. It's cooler. In the winter, Water takes a longer time to cool down. Hot air, number 2, rises and experiences a drop in atmospheric pressure. Cold air falls and experiences a rise in atmospheric pressure. Well, I love this image because you have a hot air balloon. Why? Hot air rises and experiences a drop in atmospheric pressure. So you can have such things as hot air balloons. No one calls them, after all, cold air balloons. Well, the understanding of those 2 weather commandments, so to speak, would help us understand a very important distinction in terms of climate for China and for most of Asia. And that distinction is called a monsoon. Now, sometimes when we think of monsoons, we think of torrential rains and steaming hot jungles, etc. Some kind of the things we sort of see in films. But that is not what monsoons are. A monsoon climate is one that has distinct wet and dry seasons. So some parts of the year it's very dry, some parts it's very rainy. So, for instance, Cincinnati is clearly not a monsoon climate because we have precipitation, rain, snow, etc., pretty much, not necessarily evenly, but pretty much distributed throughout the year. That is, we don't have distinct wet and dry seasons. We may have some seasons that are a little wetter or a little drier than others, but not distinct wet and dry seasons. The second thing to conjure up when you think of a monsoon is the fact that it's really due to this giant landmass called Eurasia. The Eurasian continent, consisting of Europe and Asia, are giant, the largest in the world. And because of that, and because of the vast Pacific Ocean to the east of the Eurasian continent, you really have the continents and the oceans playing with the differing air pressures. Remember we said that air over land heats up and cools down more rapidly than that over water? Well, imagine if you have a big giant landmass like Eurasia and a big giant ocean like the Pacific. That really determines the monsoons of Asia. Well, if you can see down here on the right-hand side, the major monsoon that hits East and South China is the summer, called the southwest monsoon, because a lot of the winds are coming from the southwest. In the summer, this great Asian landmass heats up faster than the surrounding Indian Ocean down here and the Pacific Ocean over here. And when the Asian landmass heats up faster, remember, hot air rises. And as it rises, it sets up a great low pressure system over Asia. And winds go from high pressure to low pressure. So that's higher pressure here in the Indian Ocean and here over in the Pacific Ocean. It's lower pressure here. So the winds sweep in from the Pacific Ocean and from the Indian Ocean. They're going to get caught up here in the Himalaya Mountains, but over here they're going to move into China and they're going to bring some moisture-laden winds, which are really, and rains, with the monsoon rains in summer, which are very important for China, particularly for the growing of rice, because rice needs lots of moisture. Rice literally grows in water, in rice paddies. South China also experiences what's called the East Asian winter monsoon, and below left, and there just the opposite happens. The Asian landmass during winter cools down much faster than the surrounding Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean. So look what happens here. A high pressure zone is established over Asia. Low pressure over the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Winds go from high pressure to low pressure. So a lot of these dry winds are going to sweep this way. That's not going to help most areas of China because they're going to be dry winds coming out of Mongolia. But see what they do when they go down here. Some of them go over the East China Sea, South China Sea, and they're going to end up bringing moisture-laden winds in and hitting South China and picking up some rain and producing some rain in these areas down here. Now, another thing that you need to know, because it also will explain a lot about Chinese history, particularly about the nomadic peoples, the barbarian peoples that would attack China every so often. And you may already know this from Roman history or from early European history. The steppes are literally these kind of this large pink area stretching across Eurasia. And they were inhabited, or used to be inhabited a lot years ago, by pastoral nomads. Nomadic peoples moving from place to place with the seasons, with their livestock animal, could be sheep, could be goats, whatever, and moving those livestock around. The Eurasian steppes is pictured here, stretched from the Danube River in Europe across the plain of Hungary through Russia, north of the Black, Caspian, and Aral Seas, east to the Pamirs, which are plateaus and mountains. This is where, by the way, the Silk Road, sorry, this is hidden a little bit here, the Silk Road really stretched across the steppes themselves, and the Silk Road was a series of roads which, of course, connected China with the old Roman Empire. So who lived in the steppes? Well, the steppes were flat and dry areas of short grasses. They received very little rainfall, so they were semi-arid. They had few trees. And before the 19th century AD, when the steel plow came along and barbed wire and railroads and new kinds of vegetation and crops that didn't need were hybrid crops that didn't need as much rainfall. Well, before the 19th century AD, largely, again, nomadic peoples inhabited these areas, and occasionally their populations of their livestock and their populations of people would increase, and people would move out of the steppes. Usually one tribe would move out of their area, move into another tribe's area, etc., etc., and in a domino-like effect, they would eventually run up against the Roman Empire or the Chinese Empire and would attack those places. Here you see some of the Silk Road, some of the routes of the Silk Road passing through the steppes. Well, this is just a really great map of China, showing some of the important areas that we're going to be discussing just really quickly. Again, this is an overview history of China, so we literally do have a lot of ground to cover, both in terms of literal geographic landscape as well as chronologically. So let's just look quickly at some of the areas of China. Here is the Great Plain of China, where lots of people live, right? And it is, it has the Yellow River, which is one of the two most important rivers of China. And it also has some very rich loess soil. Loess soil is wind-blown soil. Remember we talked about those monsoons that blow out of Mongolia, bringing these dry winds with soil, sand, this yellow-like sand that in soil that is deposited all over the Great Plain of China. It's very rich, and it gives its name literally to the Yellow River because of its yellow color. Now this is the area of China. It doesn't receive as much rain as southeastern China, so you're going to see more traditional crops that we're accustomed to, things like wheat and millet that are grown in the Great China Plain. Well, southeast China has the Qingling Mountains, and you can see those here, along with the Hua River, and it is known, along with the Yangtze River, for the cultivation down here of rice. This is also where the Three Gorges Dam is being built along the Yangtze River. Now, if you look at northeast China or Manchuria, you're coming up to this area here, which is north of North Korea. That has cold winters, but it's very rich in minerals. So later on in history, the Russians are going to be interested in that, and the Japanese are going to be interested in that. Everyone wants a piece of Manchuria for its minerals. Then there's the plateau steppe of Mongolia, where, the Mongols live. Bitterly cold winters and hot summers. Then you have over here the Tibetan plateau of the Qinghai Xizang Plateau. So this is tableland, plateau, high-lying tableland, which has at its southern boundary the Himalaya Mountains. Then you have the Xinjiang Desert Basins, containing up here the Kunlun Shan, that's Kunlun Mountains, and the Tian Shan Mountains. So this Xinjiang Desert Basin lies between two mountain ranges, and hence that explains partly why it is so dry and desert-like. And it will contain the Taklamakan Desert, the Pamir Plateau, again the Tian Shan Mountains, and of course through these areas the Silk Road would run. Now, that's looking at China at, say, 10,000 feet up. Now we're going to look at China at even a higher altitude, say 35,000 feet up. We historically divide China, historical China, imperial China, into two geographic areas. So we're going to make it even easier. One is North China and one is South China. How much easier could it get than that? In North China, again, wheat, millet, those kinds of grains are grown. In South China, rice is grown. North China is known for the Yellow River, the Huanghe. So here you see the Yellow River, the Huanghe. And it's known for the Yellow Sea, where the Yellow River flows into. South China is known for the Yangtze River and the East China Sea, where it flows into. And you can see that the dividing point between the two, between North China and South China, is generally the Qin Mountains and the Daba Mountains. Okay, so real easy, North China, South China. Well, along the Yellow River, the Huanghe, is where a lot of the early civilizations will occur, and with watersheds, tributaries flowing into it. First, we want to say some general overviews. That the Chinese have the oldest continuous civilization in the world, going back some 4,000 years, and the oldest centralized state, which has survived with interruptions since 221 BC. We transcribe Chinese writing into English by two major methods. Excuse me. One is Wei-Giles, which is the older method, and the newer is Pinyin. The PowerPoint utilizes, for the most part, the Pinyin system, and I forgot to change this textbook name here. I used to use another textbook, but your textbook, the Dragon textbook also uses the Pinyin system. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the dynastic cycle. The Chinese, even in early times, looked at their history and said, what we kind of notice is this dynastic cycle. A ruler that will come to power, usually a strong military ruler. He organizes a dynasty, right? Becomes emperor. Collects taxes, appoints officials, puts in all kinds of programs. And then, after 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 emperors, they start to get a little lazy, a little soft. They let their ministers do more and more things. And over time, the peasants get a little upset over the amount of taxes they have to pay. All kinds of natural disasters occur. The peasants rebel, and a dynasty falls. And the cycle starts all over again when a new strong military leader, somebody comes along and forms a new dynasty. The Chinese refer to this as the dynastic cycle. It is very much related to the emperor, who they called the emperor the Son, S-O-N, as in the Son of Heaven. And heaven they didn't mean as something in the Christian sense that we did, but, something out there. And the emperor was responsible for not only ruling and being a good ruler, but performing all of the essential religious rites and rituals that would maintain harmony. Harmony between the heaven and the earth. As long as the Son of Heaven, the emperor, was seen to hold the mandate of heaven, that is really the right to rule, everything was okay. If he could just maintain harmony. Harmony between nature and the people, harmony between the peoples themselves, harmony between him and those he ruled. But what happens if something would go wrong? What happens if the weather turned bad and there were tremendous rains and floods along the Yellow River? And the Yellow River flooded and the people were starving because the crops were flooded. Well, then people might say, this flood is a portent. It's a sign from heaven that the mandate of heaven has fallen from the emperor, has fallen from the Son of Heaven. Now you might say, gee, that doesn't sound good. And I mean, the poor emperor can't help that there were floods. Here's the trick. A good emperor would have maintained good levees, that is, dikes, flood walls along the river, which the Chinese did for years and years, centuries. And a bad emperor would have allowed those to kind of break down for the Yellow River to build up silt. And, the river wouldn't have been dredged, etc., etc. A good emperor would have kept, from good years, crops and grain in storehouses. So in case something horrible happened and there was a famine or locusts or a flood, that he could feed the people. So you see, actually it did have a lot to do with the emperor and what he could control, although it's more designed, it is with many ancient peoples, to be sort of, a church kind of state thing together. People didn't see government in the way that we see government as, some separation between church and state, some separation that we believe in a secular kind of government. It was all kind of put into one category with them. So, if the mandate of heaven fell from the Son of Heaven, the emperor, it would be okay for the peasants to rebel. Now, that's something that you didn't see happen in Western civilization. Peasants rebelling, bringing down dynasties, and new dynasties being formed. Well, let's talk real quickly, now that we've hit the whole overview, about early man, early human beings in China. There is a vast range of dates. Some archaeologists feel that there are fossil remains that are up to 3 million years old in China. Other people say, 1.7 to 2 million years is a safe bet. It is millions of years, and it keeps getting pushed back by archaeologists. Peking man used to be the oldest discovery, first uncovered in 1929 and dated at 500,000 years. Peking man had certain characteristics of Asian people, including shovel-shaped incisor teeth. Well, let's skip up to the New Stone Age, the Neolithic New Stone Age in Japan. And here we see human habitation right around the present-day city of Xi'an. Archaeologists have discovered an ancient site near Banpo, near a bend of the Yellow River. And since the time that they uncovered that, other similar sites have been unearthed, offering scholars a glimpse of what has been variously termed the Banpo or Yangshao or painted pottery culture, which probably, was about circa 5,000 to 3,000 BC. So some of the earliest civilizations in the world appear in China. The Yangshao people lived in pit dwellings, literally these dwellings that were built down 2 to 3 feet in the earth, probably provided them with more cooling in the summer and more heat in the winter. And then they would have had, thatched huts above those. So they seem to be a settled society, and they seem to have domesticated animals, stone tools, and even some millet fields. It is possible that they practice some slash and burn agriculture, and that's the type where you go in and, slash down everything you can and then burn down the rest like the trees, and that provides you with very fertile soil. They supplemented their diet with hunting and fishing. We know that because fish hooks of stone still survive, as well as old bows and arrows. They made hemp fabric, and in addition, they buried their dead in special burial grounds. Another early culture of the Neolithic time was the black pottery culture called the Longshan culture. It might have existed later than the painted pottery culture, although the chronological sequence of the two is really not yet clear. They could have possibly, those two cultures, the Yangshao and the Longshan, could have possibly about coexisted with one another. Their pottery was thinner than that of the Yangshao and was sometimes decorated with cord impressions. And we do know that they practiced scapulomancy, which is a type of prophecy where they heated bones of animals in a fire, and they read the resulting cracks for answers to their problems or questions. In agriculture, the black pottery culture introduced rice, water chestnuts, and various vegetables. The first real dynasty of China is the Xia dynasty. And again, I'm giving things in the pinyin first, which is the more recent way of looking at things. Here are its traditional dates. It's probably a factual dynasty, but there are no written records from the era, but there is some archaeological evidence. And so, other than that, we don't have too much to say about it. But we do have more to say about the Shang dynasty, which here are its dates. And C or CA, sometimes I use different things, means circa. The Shang dynasty was the great age of bronze in China. And it was also the dynasty that we associate with oracle bones. This is when they would take, and these oracle bones, by the way, were first discovered in 1899 by archaeologists. But these oracle bones gave the names of virtually all the traditional rulers of the Shang dynasty, as well as other history. They were bones of animals, usually the undershells of tortoises, and they were used in divination. That means they were used to determine the future. Have you ever driven down the highway and all of a sudden you're on the expressway and a truck throws a rock up into your windshield, and all of a sudden you start to get, over the days and days as things heat up on your windshield, you start to see this mark, and all of a sudden these cracks start to spread out from the mark? Well, this is kind of like what they did with the oracle bones. They would take like the undershell of a tortoise or the scapula bones, the shoulder bones of some animals, drill a hole into it, heat the bone over the fire, and then they would examine the cracks, and from the cracks they would have priests who would prophesy what would happen. So very oftentimes they have the question written on the bones, and then the prophecy, written also on the bones, sometimes a short account of what had actually happened. In these early oracle bones, we start to see the pictographic Chinese language appearing on the oracle bones. And here are some examples. Here are the modern Chinese equivalents. And it's interesting to look at these because if you look at the sun, this does look like a little sun. This does look like a little moon. This might look like the east, which is the sun coming up behind a tree. This looks like a sacrifice, which is a bird. And these are two hands putting the bird over a tripod fire to sacrifice. And then you might say, well, what's going on over here? And when they couldn't draw something like a sun or moon, and if they had to express something like also, they pronounced also li, which actually is a homophone, sounds the same as li, which means armpit. So see this little guy, and that's pointing to his armpits. To come was pronounced lai, and lai was a food plant. So this is that food plant. And then you can see how over time, it's kind of hard to take a brush and draw a circle. So over time, they squared things off. So you can see how this became this became this became this, etc. So you see the pictographic Chinese language. By the way, to be kind of literate as an adult at college level in China, you would have to memorize about 50,000 of these pictographs. Okay, well, we're going to move on to the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou people were originally vassals of the Shang dynasty, and then later on they invaded the Shang people. The Zhou people were settled agricultural people. They lived west of the Shang society, and they lived in the area of what was called the Wei River, which is actually a tributary of the Yellow River, that is the Wenghe. In turn, so they took over, and in turn, right around 771 BC, a nomadic tribe from the west invaded the Wei Valley capital of the Western Zhou people. So the Zhou people moved east and created a new eastern phase of their society. Now, the things that you should know about the Zhou is that this was the period of iron in the 600s BC. Iron was introduced, bringing about all kinds of changes in agricultural tools and weapons. So that was very important to the Zhou people. Now, we need to discuss real quickly several different philosophies and religions that impacted China. One of them was brought Buddhism to China from India. Siddhartha Gautama is considered the Buddha. He lived circa in these dates, and he founded Buddhism. He grew up as a prince, and was trying to find his way in life. And some people said, well, you can only find that if you go off into the forest and become, a mendicant and, meditate on things and, don't eat a lot, don't drink a lot. And he didn't figure that that was a good way to do things. He tried that. And the other people said, well, maybe drink and be merry. And he said, no, there's a middle way. There's a middle way in life. And he also said that it's very important to understand that life is difficult and life is filled with the Four Noble Truths. The first one of which is, all about life is filled with sorrow and suffering. That sorrow and suffering, number 2, is caused by our desires. Number 3, the only way to really control, I think you've all heard this before. If not, it's not, intensely important for you to know. But anyhow, that you would realize that the way to come to understanding was through meditation, through an eightfold path, mostly which involved meditation. Well, to make a long story short, Buddhism emerged in 2 different fashions. A Theravada Buddhism, which was a belief that to achieve nirvana, you needed to leave the world behind and enter a monastery. Now, let me explain to you quickly what nirvana is. Nirvana is kind of difficult to describe. Usually it's described in the following way. Nirvana is like what you have when the candle is blown out and the smoke kind of disappears and dissipates into the air. And so when one dies, you would become one with the whole. That would be nirvana. Theravada Buddhism said to achieve that, you had to leave the world behind, enter a monastery, and become a monk. Mahayana Buddhism was the belief that you could live in this world and still achieve nirvana if you lived a good moral life. And it introduced the concept of the bodhisattva, a deceased human being who could attain nirvana if he chose to do so, but out of compassion has volunteered to delay nirvana to help others attain nirvana. They were like almost Buddhist saints. Buddhism was ultimately introduced into China, where it existed side by side with Confucianism. The two were not seen as being exclusive. You could be both a Buddhist and a Confucianist. So Confucianism. Confucius lived about this time period, before the Warring States period. Things were beginning to fall apart in China, and he looked back to the Zhou Dynasty, and he said, that's when things were really good, and we've got to get back to the respect and the dignity of those times. We have to rebuild civility, and we do that with respect to relationships. And he talked about 5 relationships between a father, son, a ruler, subject, an elder brother, younger brother, husband, wife, elder friend, junior friend. And these were reciprocal relationships. So a son was supposed to obey his father, but a father in turn was to teach his son a trade. A father was to lead and mentor, be a good father to his son, etc. And of course this is applied to the ruler. The ruler is to be a good ruler to his subjects. The subjects are to offer their obedience to the ruler, but if the ruler is not a good ruler, remember, you can rebel. Confucianism had a long legacy in China. It became, for all intents and purposes, the philosophy of China. The way the whole entire government, culture, and economy revolved around. And it really talked about being trained in the Confucian classic was important if you wanted to become a government official. You needed to know and study the Confucian classics. It also brought about an acute social sensitivity in China, the importance of saving face, of not being an embarrassment to the group. And it also emphasized studying the Confucian classics like the Analects, memorizing them. So it really led, along with the fact that you had to learn up to 50,000 Chinese characters, ideograms, it led to this memorization that was so popular in China. Now, Confucius believed that leaders should be virtuous, and by being virtuous, they would lead the people, and the people would learn from them. Mencius was a follower of Confucius. He believed that people were born good. So again, this whole philosophy is people are born good inherently, so they can even learn to be better and be more virtuous by following virtuous leaders. Shunji later on would change this and start to think that people were born selfish. 2 different philosophies. This might lead, as it did eventually, to this, the idea of legalism. The idea that the only way you can keep people in check are to have strict laws, rules, and regulations that should never be questioned, and if they don't like it, they should be punished. Under Shangyang, a legalist, who was chief minister of the state of Qin, he pushed legalism. And the ironic thing is, he passed some legislation at one point in time that said that everybody needed to have documents proving who they were, where they were from, etc., these proper identifications. And so when he fell out of favor, he escaped, he was banished. He tried to hide at a hotel, but the owner of the hotel wouldn't accept him because he didn't have proper identification. So eventually he's executed by being drawn and quartered. Taoism is another philosophy of China. founded by Lao Tzu, who may or may not have lived. There's different debates over that. If he did live, then he wrote the Tao Te Ching, The Way and Its Power, and then supposedly rode off on a water buffalo to the west and was never seen again. Taoism has this idea of yin and yang, and it's usually depicted this way. And, there's yin and there's, of course, yang. And one is male and one is female. And so basically, if you would try to draw a diameter through this yin and yang, you would find out that you would get a little bit of both. That human beings are made up a little bit of the yin and a little bit of the yang. One more concept that we have to introduce is manorialism and feudalism. In ancient agricultural societies, typically what would happen is population would increase. So like these wooden figures, more and more people would be living on the same amount of land. That meant that their quality of life was really declining. It was getting harder and harder to feed more and more people on the same amount of land, which produced basically the same amount of crops. Meanwhile, usually the civilizations, like the Chinese civilization, they were growing. The emperors were taxing the people more. Noblemen very oftentimes were exempt from taxation. That is, the wealthy, the rich, the noblemen, the aristocracy, whatever you want to call, oftentimes were exempt from taxation. The tax burden usually fell most heavily on the peasants. And the peasants, of course, were not experiencing good conditions because population was increasing and, agricultural production was not. So sometimes what the peasants would do is, in order not to be burdened by taxes, they would give their land to wealthy people around them who had tax exemptions. And as they began to give their land to wealthy people around them, to lords of manors, we would have called it in Western Europe, a manorialism or seniorialism, a manorial or seniorial system developed where the peasants no longer had to pay taxes to the central government, the emperor, but they worked. They no longer owned their land, and they worked kind of as serfs for the wealthy people. Well, you can see what's going to happen eventually here. By the way, this is the Japanese equivalent of it. I haven't found a good Chinese equivalent of it, so you can just ignore this. The wealthy people would begin developing private armies of their own, and the central government would fall because it didn't have enough tax revenue coming in, since the wealthy people who now were owning more and more of the land were tax exempt. And then manorialism, the economic system, moves into feudalism, the political equivalent of it. Eventually, everything's going to fix itself again, and we'll see some things happen which makes the merchant class rise, and manorialism and feudalism dies away, and the central government reappears. Okay, so let's look quickly at the Warring States period. They're called Warring States period because 7 Chinese kingdoms were fighting one another. And one of those kingdoms was the kingdom of Zhang. And out of this kingdom, the kingdom of Qin, the kingdom of Qin, out of the kingdom of Qin came Zhang, who would later be called Qin Shi Huang Di. In 221 BC, Zhang completed the unification of China and became Qin Shi Huang Di, the first emperor of China. See, Qin, China, China, Qin. That's where we get the name. So the Qin dynasty begins in 221 BC. It considers itself the middle kingdom, literally the middle of the world. And it did a lot of fascinating things. Standardized weights and measured, standardized and improved roads, built new irrigation system, issued new coins, simplified Chinese characters, ordered a burning of the books and buried 460 intellectuals alive, unified a series of older walls into the first Great Wall, Took some 500,000 people to construct it. And then, before he died, Qin became obsessed with finding a way to live forever. And so he had his ministers work on a secret of immortality, and his alchemists devised pills containing mercury, which they hoped would let him live forever, but which ironically probably killed him. And he had, while he was still living, an elaborate tomb built for himself, surrounded by an underground terracotta army. And this is the famous terracotta army of Qin Shi Huangdi. Well, the Qin dynasty began falling apart, and the Han dynasty began to take control. The Han dynasty will rule at it'll be the contemporary, really, of the Roman Empire in the West. And it was one of China's great empires. During the Han dynasty, things were very prosperous. The peasants performed corvée labor, forced labor. They built, palaces and roads and walls and things of that sort. That was the way that in ancient kingdoms things got done. They actually, though, were pretty good on the peasants. The Han dynasty reduced land taxation. They reduced it to 1/15 of the annual harvest. Later, they even reduced it further to 1/30 of the harvest. The economy burgeoned as a result. Agricultural production increased. Population rose to nearly 60 million people by 2 AD. By the 1st century BC, the government bureaucracy numbered nearly 130,000 officials. I mean, this was really the world's great empire in the East, in Asia. And they already started to have the initial steps leading to an examination system for those government employees. So the peasants then worked corvée labor, and things were going well for a while, but inevitably that crisis set in. More and more people, not enough land to support all the people. Some of the peasants were really feeling the brunt of things, and so they began to move to the estates of larger landowners. So more and more, so the tax burden fell heavier on the remaining independent peasants, and not surprisingly, a series of large-scale peasant revolts commenced. Wang Mong, the nephew of a dowager empress, that is, the widow of an emperor, deposed an infant emperor and usurped the throne in AD 9. He wanted to nationalize all of the great private estates and to redistribute the land to tax-paying peasants. Imagine how that upset the wealthy people. And then when his reforms didn't go quickly enough, the peasants started to get aggravated and opposed him. And within 3 years, they forced him to repeal most of his reforms, that is, the wealthy and powerful. The peasants, meanwhile, became dissatisfied with him, and a peasant rebellion called the Red Eyebrows broke out, which killed Wang Mong in AD 23. The Han dynasty begins to slowly fall apart. There are more local peasant rebellions that occurred, more peasants who simply can no longer take the amount of taxation. More and more go to large manors, and these manors developed their own professional armies. Finally, a new peasant rebellion broke out in AD 184 called the Yellow Turbans. By the way, the peasants dressed with their yellow turbans. This rebellion, the Yellow Turbans, deteriorated into a struggle between provincial warlords, and the Han dynasty fell in AD 220. China then emerged for 350 years, basically, into a period of disunity, incessant warfare during the period of what was called the Three Kingdoms and after, further weakened China internally, making it increasingly vulnerable to external attacks. In the early 300s, the nomadic Xiongnu, we know him as the Huns, came in and took control. So here you see the Han Empire, and you see the Silk Road, the Great Wall, etc. And here you see a little comic that you can enjoy. Well, so this period of disunity arose. And it would not be until 581, the Sui dynasty, which would be founded by a general of mixed Chinese and barbarian blood. He would reunite North and South China, and the economy would recover. But natural disasters would result in rebellions, and the Sui dynasty fell, and the Tang dynasty would next come along in 618. It was founded by a military general, marked by a very sophisticated governmental machinery. Its capital was at Chang'an, or what is now Xi'an, on the Wei River. The population of its capital was nearly 2 million people during the Tang dynasty, making it the largest city in the world. The Tang dynasty reached its height under the Empress Wu, a young concubine of the second emperor of the dynasty who ruthlessly worked her way into power, deposing her own son. She, in turn, was deposed at the age of 80 in 705. Under her, the Tang dynasty reached its ultimate borders, reaching all the way into Manchuria, Korea, and Vietnam. One of the important things that the Tang dynasty achieved was something that you don't see at all in Western civilization, the equal field system, whereby the government surveyed all of the land, took a census, and every able-bodied peasant male between 18 and 60 was given a full share of land, about 13.7 acres, less for people under 18, over 60, or less for females. Every 6 years, they performed a new census and redistributed things. So this continues for a while. It's important. It's unheard of in the West. And then all of a sudden, an emperor became enthralled with a young lady, and the young lady, in turn, became enthralled with a fat, coarse general of Turkish origin named An-Lushan. And a rebellion occurred, the An-Lushan Rebellion. It was sort of the beginning of the end for the Tang dynasty, and China would be divided into North China in a 5 dynasties period, Central and South China in a 10 dynasty period, and it would not come together again until the Song dynasty, founded by a military commander, brought it together in 960. And we'll talk more about the Song dynasty next time. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you, and it's been a